The rain fell through holes in the bombed roof like tears from a wounded sky. Hilda Brenner sat on a splintered wooden bench, her fingers wrapped around a photograph so worn that the edges had softened to fabric. In the picture, her younger sister Lotte smiled beneath a summer sun that no longer existed. 3 months ago, Soviet soldiers had marched Lotte east with hundreds of other women from Dresden. Hilda had not heard from her since. The railway station in Bavaria had once been beautiful. Now, it was a skeleton of shattered glass and crumbling stone, packed with 200 German women who waited in silence for whatever came next. American soldiers stood at every exit, their rifles casual but present. The war had ended 12 days ago. Germany had surrendered. The killing was supposed to be over, but Hilda knew better. The killing had simply changed its shape. She was 32 years old and had spent the last 3 years as a nurse in military hospitals, stitching together boys who would never walk again, holding hands as young men called for mothers who would never come. When the Eastern Front collapsed, she fled west with millions of others, desperate to reach the American lines before the Soviets caught them. She almost made it. Almost. Now she sat in this broken station, classified by the Americans as a displaced person, waiting to learn her fate. A crackling loudspeaker announced the news in broken German. All detainees would be repatriated to their home regions within 72 hours. Those from territories now under Soviet control would be transferred to Red Army custody at designated checkpoints. The words hung in the air like poison gas that a woman from Silesia screamed. She threw herself against the station doors, clawing at the wood until American military police pulled her back. She collapsed to the floor, sobbing that the Soviets had killed her husband and her sons, that she would die before she let them take her too. The MPs looked uncomfortable. They did not understand what she was saying, but they understood the terror in her voice. Hilda watched without moving. She had learned to freeze her face during the war, to hide her emotions behind the mask that nurses wore when everything around them was falling apart. But inside, her heart was pounding. She was from Saxony. Her home was now in the Soviet occupation zone. If the Americans sent her back, she would share whatever fate had swallowed her sister. The Soviets were not merciful to German women. Everyone knew this. The stories had spread through refugee columns like wildfire. Mass assaults in captured villages, deportations to labor camps in Siberia, executions of anyone suspected of resistance. The Red Army had suffered 20 million dead fighting Germany. Their revenge was biblical in its fury that a voice beside her broke through the silence. They cannot send us back. They cannot. Hilda turned. The speaker was a woman perhaps 45 years old, with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone who had once commanded classrooms. Her name was Margit Vogel, a schoolteacher from Königsberg, now a city that no longer belonged to Germany. The Soviets had renamed it Kaliningrad and expelled its entire population. The Americans do not understand, Hilda replied quietly. They think the war is over. For them, it is. Margit's voice was bitter. They will go home to their farms and their families. We will go into the darkness. On Hilda's other side sat a girl who had not spoken since her capture. Anna Fisher was 19 years old, a factory worker from a village near the Polish border. Her eyes were empty. Whatever she had seen before the Americans found her had driven the words from her throat. She stared at the floor and rocked slightly, arms wrapped around her knees. Hilda reached over and touched the girl's shoulder. Anna flinched but did not pull away. Across the station, an American sergeant was speaking with a translator. Hilda watched him carefully. He was young, perhaps 28, with the sun-weathered face of someone who had grown up working outdoors. His uniform was rumpled, his boots muddy. Unlike the officers who moved through the station with clipboard efficiency, this man seemed troubled. He kept glancing at the women, then looking away. The translator said something that made him stop. His face changed. Hilda saw him ask a question, and the translator answered. Later, she would learn what the translator had said. The women were not asking for food or medicine or blankets. They were begging the Americans to shoot them rather than send them east. The sergeant stared at the translator for a long moment. Then he walked away, his shoulders stiff. Night fell. The station grew cold. Hilda lay on the concrete floor beside Margit and Anna, listening to women weeping in the darkness. Somewhere outside, trucks rumbled past, carrying supplies to the victorious armies that now carved Europe into pieces. Through a cracked window, Hilda could see the eastern horizon. Beyond those distant hills lay Soviet checkpoints, Red Army patrols, and a future that terrified her more than any battlefield she had survived. She closed her eyes and prayed for a miracle she did not believe would come. Sergeant James Callahan had not slept in 36 hours. He sat in the camp's processing office, a converted storage room that smelled of mildew and cigarette smoke, staring at transfer documents bearing the names of 200 women. Each name represented a file, a destination, a fate. His job was simple: process the paperwork, load the trucks, move on to the next camp. That he had joined the Army in 1942, a farm boy from Iowa who wanted to fight the evil he saw in newsreels. He had landed at Normandy, survived the Hurtgen Forest, watched friends die in frozen foxholes during the Bulge. He had seen things that would haunt him forever. But nothing had prepared him for this strange purgatory of the occupation, where enemies became refugees and allies became executioners. The women in the camp were not soldiers. They were nurses, teachers, factory workers, mothers. Some had fled the Soviets. Others had been swept up in the chaos of Germany's collapse. All of them were scheduled for repatriation, sorted by home region like packages in a postal center. Those from the east would be handed to Soviet custody at border checkpoints. Those from the west would be released to rebuild their shattered lives. Captain Richard Wells entered the office without knocking. He was a career officer, 40 years old, with the impatient efficiency of a man who measured success in completed forms and cleared backlogs. Status report, Sergeant. Processing on schedule, sir. Transfers begin at noon tomorrow. Good. Any problems? Callahan hesitated. He thought about the woman who had thrown herself against the doors. He thought about the faces pressed against the chain-link fence, eyes hollow with a fear he was only beginning to understand. No problems, sir. Wells nodded and left. Callahan returned to his paperwork, but the names blurred before his eyes. That afternoon, a translator brought him to the fence. A group of women had gathered on the other side, led by a nurse with steady hands and a schoolteacher with silver hair. They held a stack of papers covered in signatures. They call it a petition, the translator explained. They're asking for asylum. They say if you send them east, they will be killed or sent to Siberia. Callahan took the papers through a gap in the wire. 87 names. Some women had drawn small crosses beside their signatures. Others had written single words in German that he could not read. What are these words? He asked. Prayers, the translator said quietly. They're writing prayers. He brought the petition to Captain Wells. The captain glanced at it for exactly 3 seconds before tossing it onto his desk. We're not in the business of adopting German civilians, Sergeant. The Soviets are our allies. These women go east. Sir, with respect, they're terrified. They think, I don't care what they think. Wells' voice was ice. We have orders. The Yalta Conference established repatriation protocols. Every displaced person returns to their country of origin. That includes Soviet territory. One more word about this, and you'll be on report. Callahan stood at attention until Wells dismissed him. He walked back to his quarters with his fists clenched so tight his knuckles turned white. That night, the girl named Anna spoke for the first time. Hilda was sitting beside her when it happened. Anna had been staring at the ceiling, motionless as always, when suddenly words began pouring out in a whisper so soft that Hilda had to lean close to hear. Anna described what had happened to her village. The Soviet soldiers had arrived in April, drunk on victory and vodka. They had dragged the women into barns and houses while the men were forced to watch. Anna's mother had tried to protect her. The soldiers had shot her mother in the street. Anna spoke for 10 minutes, her voice flat and empty, describing horrors that no 19-year-old should ever have witnessed. When she finished, she began to shake. Hilda held her. There were no words adequate for such darkness. She simply wrapped her arms around the girl and let her tremble. Near midnight, Callahan appeared at the fence. He was alone. The other guards had been paid to look away with cigarettes and chocolate bars. Hilda approached the wire. In broken German and broken English, they managed a conversation. "I cannot stop the transfer," Callahan said, "but I'm going to try something. There may be a way. I need you to trust me." "What?" Hilda asked. "Why do you care what happens to us?" Callahan looked at her for a long moment. "Because I didn't come halfway around the world to deliver people to their deaths." He disappeared into the darkness. Hilda stood at the fence, watching the eastern horizon, wondering if hope was a gift or a trap. At dawn, the transport trucks arrived. The transfer was scheduled for noon. The clock was running. The intelligence officer was a woman, which surprised Callahan. Lieutenant Margaret Holt sat behind a cluttered desk, studying the file folder he had placed in front of her with eyes that missed nothing. She was 30 years old, Harvard-educated, and one of the few female officers in the European theater of operations. She had spent the war interrogating captured German officers and decoding enemy communications. She knew lies the way a jeweler knew diamonds. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that these women have intelligence value regarding German military operations?" "Yes, ma'am. Factory workers, nurses, a school teacher." She flipped through the documents. And this intelligence just happened to surface 12 hours before their scheduled transfer. Callahan kept his face neutral. He had forged the documents overnight, creating fictional reports of conversations that never happened, hints of knowledge that did not exist. It was the clumsiest deception of his life, and Holt had seen through it in seconds. She closed the folder and looked at him. "Sergeant, do you understand what happens if I report this?" "Yes, ma'am." "Court-martial. Dishonorable discharge. Prison time." "Yes, ma'am." Lieutenant Holt stood and walked to the window. Outside, the camp stretched beneath a gray sky. Women moved between barracks, guarded by soldiers who saw them as statistics, problems to be processed and forgotten. "I've read the reports from the eastern zones," she said quietly. "I know what the Soviets are doing to German civilians, especially women." She turned back to face him. "Your paperwork is garbage, Sergeant. Anyone with half a brain could see it's forged." Callahan said nothing. There was nothing to say. "But I'm going to delay the transfer for 24 hours. Holt's voice hardened. "I'll cite the need for further interrogation. That gives you 1 day to find another solution. After that, my hands are tied." She handed back the folder. "Don't make me regret this." Callahan walked out of the intelligence tent and into a world that had given him exactly 24 hours to save 200 lives. Word spread through the camp within the hour. The transfer had been delayed. Some women wept with relief. Others sat in stunned silence, afraid to believe that salvation was possible. Margaret gathered them in small groups, speaking in low tones about what might come next. "Do not celebrate yet," she warned. "Delay is not deliverance. We must prepare for every possibility." That night, Callahan and Hilda met at the fence again. He spoke quickly, knowing that every minute increased the risk of discovery. "There's a refugee column moving toward the British zone. The British aren't following the same repatriation rules. If you can reach their sector, you might be safe." "How far?" 30 miles. Through occupied territory. Without papers. Hilda absorbed this information. 30 miles meant walking all night through countryside patrolled by Soviet and American forces. It meant crossing checkpoints, avoiding patrols, moving through forests and fields without maps or guides. It meant gambling everything on the chance that the British would offer protection the Americans had denied. "How many can go?" she asked. "Not everyone. Some women are too old or too sick to make the journey. You'll have to choose." The weight of those words settled on Hilda's shoulders like a physical burden. She would have to look into the faces of 200 women and decide which ones would have a chance at freedom and which would remain behind. Margaret volunteered before Hilda could ask. "I will stay with those who cannot travel. Someone must keep them calm. Someone must help them survive whatever comes." "Margaret, I am too old for a 30-mile march in the dark." The schoolteacher smiled, but her eyes were serious. "Get the young ones out. Someone has to survive to tell what happened here." They spent the next hours making impossible choices. 18 women were selected for the escape. The youngest, the strongest, those who might survive the journey. Anna was among them. When Hilda told her the plan, the girl nodded once, her eyes showing the first spark of life since her capture. "I will not go back," Anna whispered. "I will never go back." At midnight, Callahan cut a hole in the fence behind the latrine building. The guards he had bribed looked the other way. Hilda gathered her group in the shadows, their breath visible in the cold spring air. Margaret stood by the fence, watching. She had given Hilda her wedding ring, the only valuable thing she still possessed. "Sell it if you need to. Buy food. Buy safety." Hilda embraced her. There were no words adequate for goodbye. Point one by one, the women slipped through the hole in the fence and disappeared into the forest beyond. Hilda went last, pausing at the wire to look back at the camp where nearly 200 women would face the dawn without her. Then she turned and ran into the darkness, leading 17 souls toward an uncertain freedom. Behind her, Margaret raised her hand in silent farewell and whispered a prayer into the empty night. The forest swallowed them like a dark mouth, closing. 18 women moved single file through the blackness, their footsteps muffled by years of fallen leaves. Hilda led. Anna walked beside her. Behind them came factory workers, housewives, a pregnant teenager of 16, an elderly grandmother who refused to be left behind. None of them were soldiers. Tonight, they had to become ghosts. The countryside of post-war Bavaria was a graveyard of collapsed farms and burned villages. Soviet patrols swept the roads, hunting for German stragglers and deserters. American checkpoints controlled the main crossings. Between them lay a maze of fields and forests where anything could be hiding. They had been walking for 2 hours when the headlights appeared. Hilda threw up her hand, and the column froze. 100 meters ahead, a Soviet jeep crawled along a dirt road, its lights cutting through the trees. The women dropped flat against the forest floor, pressing their faces into the mud. The jeep stopped. Hilda heard doors open. Russian voices, casual and bored. One soldier walked into the trees. He stopped less than 20 feet from where the women lay hidden. Anna was beside her, trembling so violently that Hilda feared the ground itself would shake. She reached over and gripped the girl's hand, squeezing hard enough to hurt. The soldier lit a cigarette. The flame illuminated his face for a moment. Young, tired, unaware that 18 women were holding their breath in the darkness behind him. He finished his cigarette, tossed the butt into the leaves, and walked back to the jeep. The vehicle drove away. No one moved for 5 minutes. Then Hilda rose, and the column continued to be. Why 3 in the morning, they reached the river. The old bridge had been bombed during the Allied advance, its twisted skeleton jutting from the water like the ribs of a dead animal. The river marked the boundary between occupation zones. On the far bank lay the British sector and the hope of safety, but the river was swollen with spring rains, running fast and cold. There was no way around it. They would have to cross. Hilda waded in first, gasping as the freezing water climbed past her waist. She held a rope tied to a tree on the bank, creating a lifeline for the others to follow. The current pulled at her legs. The cold bit into her bones. She kept moving. The pregnant teenager struggled halfway across. Hilda grabbed her arm and pulled her forward. One of the factory workers lost her footing and went under. 2 others hauled her up, sputtering and coughing. The grandmother moved so slowly that Hilda feared she would freeze before reaching the far bank. Anna waded up beside the old woman. Without a word, the girl who had been silent for weeks lifted the grandmother onto her back and carried her through the deepest water. The grandmother weighed almost nothing. War and starvation had shrunk her to skin and bones. But the act itself was something more. A girl who had lost everything finding strength to save someone else. They emerged from the river soaked and shaking. The far bank was British territory. They were not safe yet, but they were closer than they had been in months. The eastern sky was turning gray when they stumbled into a British checkpoint. 2 soldiers stood guard behind a wooden barrier, their expressions shifting from boredom to astonishment as 18 bedraggled women emerged from the forest like apparitions. Hilda walked forward on legs that could barely hold her. She had spent the last 6 hours leading these women through darkness and danger, making decisions that could have killed them all. Now she stood before soldiers who wore the uniforms of the victors, and she had nothing left but 3 English words she had practiced in her mind. "Please," she said. "Help." The soldiers called for their sergeant. The sergeant called for an officer. Within an hour, the women were wrapped in blankets, drinking hot tea in a military tent, while British officials took their names and listened to their stories. The British had different rules. They were not bound by the same repatriation agreements that compelled the Americans to hand civilians back to the Soviets. The officer who interviewed Hilda made no promises, but he also made no threats. He simply nodded and wrote things down. Back at the American camp, Captain Wells discovered the escape at dawn. He demanded Callahan's arrest. Lieutenant Holt had already filed paperwork transferring the sergeant to a supply unit in France. The documents were dated 3 days earlier. By the time Wells realized what had happened, Callahan was beyond his reach. No one was ever court-martialed. In the chaos of post-war Europe, 18 missing women barely registered. There were millions of displaced persons, mountains of paperwork, and 100 more urgent problems demanding attention. The escape was quietly buried in files that no one would ever read. Spring 1946. Hilda worked as a nurse in a refugee camp near Hamburg, caring for others who had survived the war's aftermath. She had not found her sister Lotte. She might never find her, but she had saved 17 lives, and that was something the darkness could never take away. But a letter arrived one morning, forwarded through a dozen agencies and bureaucracies. It was from Margit. The women left behind at the American camp had eventually been released when Soviet policy shifted. They had scattered across occupied Germany, but they were alive. The final line of the letter read, "You gave us hope when we had none." That is something they can never take away. Hilda folded the paper carefully and placed it beside the photograph of her sister. Then she walked back into the hospital tent, where new patients waited and new wounds needed healing. Outside, the sun rose over a continent slowly learning to breathe again.